Welcome to VSOW. Today we are undertaking what I think is a really critical deep dive. We're looking at one of the most persistent and defining characteristics of modern existence, and that is the profound crisis of identity that's rooted in, well, in displacement, in rootlessness, and in massive sociological upheaval. We have a powerful and, frankly, an incredibly rich source stack for you today. It spans disciplines from, deep sociological theory. We'll be focusing most notably on Peter Berger's foundational concept of the homeless mind. But we're also pulling from penetrating post-colonial literary critiques and even some deeply intimate contemporary personal narratives about neurodivergence and late diagnosis.
It's a vast landscape to navigate, that's for
Yeah.
sure. It's challenging. But our mission here is, I think, singular and precise. We want to synthesize these really divergent views to understand the multidimensional nature of displacement.
So we're not just looking at one type of crisis here.
Not at all. We're directly comparing the macro societal shifts, these huge processes like technological modernization, secularization, with the micro-subjective experiences. The feeling of existential rootlessness, the psychological struggle.
Right.
The goal, really, is to unpack precisely how that systematic loss of traditional, stable structures creates this condition that Berger so brilliantly labeled the homeless mind. And crucially, how this rootlessness then manifests across all of human experience. From the kind of timeless longing you see captured in classical poetry, all the way to the agonizing psychological conflict we find in these very recent, very raw personal accounts.
And ultimately, for you listening, we're exploring what seems to be the central paradox of modernity.
Exactly. It's this constant tension between this unprecedented individual freedom we all have and the agonizing uncertainty, the burden that this very freedom breeds.
That tension gives us a perfect starting point, I think, to jump into the literary world. Because displacement in literature, it's so much more than just, moving from one country to another. It's treated as a key, a central notion.
A defining crisis of identity.
Yes, exactly.
Yep.
Across both post-colonial and modern literature. So before we can even get to the identity crisis itself, we probably need to make a fundamental distinction.
We do.
The sources talk about two primary forms of displacement.
And that distinction is absolutely crucial because while they both result in this profound sense of alienation, their origins are completely different. So first you have colonial displacement. This is essentially extrinsic. It's a political, exploitive, cultural act.
Something done to a people.
Precisely. It's the forced abandonment of motherlands, of cultures, traditions, languages. It's a violent external uprooting that's imposed by imperial powers. Think of the deliberate dismantling of local cultures or forced migration.
Okay, so that's the colonial. And then you have modern displacement.
Right. And the displacement that's engendered by modernity it's much more philosophical. It's epistemological in nature.
What does that mean exactly, epistemological?
It means it's about knowledge. It's the condition of being intellectually or morally or spiritually cut off from centuries of established living tradition. You might never physically leave your hometown, but the knowledge that once grounded you, that inherited wisdom that provided certainty, it just loses its credibility. It stops feeling true.
And this is where the sources say the malaise is seriously aggravated for writers coming out of that post-colonial context.
Yes.
Because they're experiencing both. They endure a twofold displacement.
The double whammy, essentially. They are historically and politically uprooted by colonial forces. They see their social structures deliberately broken. And then at the same time, they are philosophically uprooted by the pervasive conditions of modernity that just challenge all fixed meaning everywhere.
The outcome then, as we see it in their writings, is a kind of total uprooting.
It's described as a catastrophic cultural, existential, and philosophical deracination. Their work becomes this painful, essential documentation of these existentially and culturally alienated selves. They're defined by alienation, by disassociation, and by a rootlessness that cuts across every border you can imagine. Physical, cultural, spiritual.
They are, in a very real sense, doubly homeless.
That's the perfect way to put it.
This focus on rootlessness leads us to a really fascinating, almost primal concept that the sources bring up to ground the discussion, the paradise of the first place. Can you elaborate on how that idea informs this whole experience of being displaced?
I'd love to. The sources introduce this idea by suggesting that at a really foundational, almost quintessential level, almost all creatures are displaced beings. We are all, every one of us, destined to depart from that initial perfect shelter.
The paradise of the mother's womb.
A mother's womb, exactly, the first place. And this innate universal experience is then incorporated into the very concept of displacement itself.
So the reason we seek a home with such, fierce determination is because the idea of that original place where safety and identity were just perfectly integrated, that idea is imprinted on us.
Precisely. The source says the first place of any creature turns into its paradise. So if that's true, then the loss of any subsequent home, whether it's a physical land or a cultural identity, it triggers a deep existential
A
nostalgia.
longing to go back.
Yes, a longing to go back. And so the perennial drive of all displaced writers becomes this strong, almost impossible wish to return to their motherland, their cultural paradise, to try and reclaim that lost holistic identity. It's an attempt to reverse that original inescapable separation.
Wow. That puts the emotional power of displacement on an almost primal, inescapable level. It completely transcends politics. And this isn't a new phenomenon either. The sources point out we can see this yearning for the first place, even in classical periods, long before the modern condition took over.
Oh, yeah.
They cite the classical Urdu poet Wahid Allahabadi. His couplet, it perfectly encapsulates this immortal attachment to the homeland, even as he's entering the valley of alienation.
What does he say?
He speaks of the memory of homeland following him for a long time, trying to persuade him not to leave the land. It's not a memory, it's an active presence.
A persistent ache.
A profound, persistent ache, yes.
And that ache immediately sets up the central identity problematics for the displaced person, as the sources outline it. Once displacement occurs, whether it's colonial or modern, the possibility of ever reclaiming a singular, solid, monolithic identity, it just comes to an absolute end. It's gone.
So the person is caught.
Completely caught in an intractable conflict. They're unable to forget the abandoned culture, the language, the traditions, yet they find it equally difficult, maybe impossible, to disassociate fully from the new land and the new language they've been forced to adopt.
And this juxtaposition, it creates a kind of hybrid identity, right?
A hybrid identity. A complex, often contradictory view of themselves and of the guest communities they belong to. And this, the sources say, results in the birth of an indefinite crisis of identity.
You can't go back to the past, but you also can't fully assimilate into the present without this immense internal conflict, this sense of betrayal.
And this is the true agony of choice that's inherent in displacement. It's a theme that's going to echo all the way through our deep dive today. The individual has to make a painful existential calculation. They must either accept identity fluidity, with all its emotional tortures and cultural shocks, or they must perpetually bear the agonizing burden of unmanageable nostalgia for everything they left behind, the places, the language, the culture.
There's no middle ground. There's no settled certainty.
None.
We see this struggle articulated so perfectly in Khalid Javed's short story, Akhri Dawat.
The last invitation.
Right. The narrator details the miseries that come from the melting down of the monolithic self. He expresses this desire to experience himself as a being divided into many despite being an individual. He wants to embrace the fluidity.
But he can't.
But he finds unbearable suffocation in that fragmented state.
And that feeling, that unbearable suffocation, it perfectly symbolizes that twofold displacement we were talking about.
How so?
Well, it's the experience of colonial uprooting. The source notes the noose of hanging tightened by colonizers is still swinging, combined with the modern philosophical crisis. The result is the imminent death of a fixed cultural identity and a perpetual crisis of self.
Yet, and this is the paradox, right? This internal tension, this inability to find a settled home, it's frequently described as the essential engine of 20th century art and thought.
It is. The crucial insight here is that experiencing both this inherent fluidity of identities and this intense nostalgia develops into a strong creative impulse.
So the anguish provides the fuel.
Absolutely. It's no coincidence that nearly all the major writings of the 20th century originate directly from this theme of displacement. The loss of traditional certainty forced writers to create new meaning, to document the pain, and to explore the new, fractured landscapes of the self.
Can you give us some specific examples within Urdu literature where this theme is just front and center?
Certainly. I mean, we see it in the works of major figures like Karachulan Haider, Intizar Hussain, Abdul Hussain in his seminal work Udas Nas Lane.
A depressed generation.
Yes. And Mustansar Hussain Tarar and Baha or Flow. And Tarar is interesting because he expanded the definition of displacement beyond just migration. He said he felt originally like a Dravidian who was displaced by nationalist grand narratives.
So displacement can even be cultural and historical erasure within your own land.
Exactly. It's not just about physical movement.
And the ultimate psychological manifestation of this loss of home, this boss living in the jungle, is captured so powerfully by the poet Iftikhar Arif. The lines are just stark and so memorable.
What does he write?
Ghastly silence is everywhere. Dust of unidentified thoroughfares is what the body and spirit gained. How painful is to note that the life became disposed and homeless in strange city.
Disposed and homeless.
That very phrase, disposed and homeless, is the bridge we need to cross now. We need to move from the emotional truth of literature to the structural analysis of sociology. That profound literary anguish provides a perfect and I think necessary transition to the sociological framework of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman. Their 1966 work, The Social Construction of Reality, is just foundational to understanding why this displacement happens on a mass societal scale. It highlights how our common sense knowledge is built.
It really is. The core thesis that sets up our entire discussion today is that the social construction of reality is dialectical.
A dialectic, what does that mean in this context?
It means it's an ongoing cyclical process. It's composed of three moments that, while they happen simultaneously in life, are separable only when we analyze them. And we really need to unpack these three moments.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this. What are these three moments, and why is this structure so vital to understanding how we form our identities?
Okay, so the first moment is externalization. This is the process where we, as humans, through our activity, produce the social world. We interact, we create roles, we create rules, we build institutions.
We make the world.
We make the world. Then the second moment is objectivation. This is where that social world we just created acquires a reality that is independent of us, its producers. It seems solid, external, unquestionable. Think of the law, or even something like gravity. They become objective facts, regardless of whether a new generation believes in them or not. They're just there.
Okay, so we make the world, and then the world seems like it was always there, separate from us. And the third moment, you said it was internalization.
Internalization. And this is where socialization occurs. It's defined in the source as the comprehensive and consistent induction of an individual into the objective world of a society.
So in essence, that external objective world gets written onto your consciousness. It becomes your subjective reality.
That's it, exactly. And this process, particularly what's called primary socialization, is absolutely critical.
Why is primary socialization so profoundly powerful? What separates it from, say, learning a job later in life?
Because the relationship with significant others, usually parents or early caregivers, is, and I'm quoting here, highly charged emotionally. The sources emphasize that this molding of the self is based far more on the affective, the emotional aspects, than on the cognitive ones. You don't question the reality your parents present to you as a child. You feel it as fundamentally true. This deep emotional imposition of social patterns on your behavior is a remarkable phenomenon.
And that's what gives traditional society its stability.
Precisely. Which brings us directly to The Homeless Mind, the 1974 book where Berger and his colleagues argued that modernization makes this traditional process, this seamless making of consciousness, an incredibly complex, fragmented phenomena.
Okay, so let's define modernization through Berger's specific lens. It's not just about iPhones and fast trains.
No, not at all. Modernization in this context should be understood strictly as the institutional concomitants of technologically induced economic growth.
That's a mouthful. Break that down for us.
It just means the essential factors driving social change shift away from tradition and toward rational, technical means. The primary agents of change become technological production and increasingly vast, complex bureaucracy. The rise of the modern, rational state is paramount. Everything gets systematized, compartmentalized, and functionally specialized.
And hand in hand with this rationalization comes secularization. We often think of secularization as just, fewer people going to church, but Berger defines it much more broadly, correct?
Oh, absolutely. For him, secularization is a socio-historical process where increasing areas of society law, education, medicine, politics are structurally subtracted from religious government or authority. When this happens, it systematically undermines the traditional value hierarchy, which was the very thing that legitimized all of those institutions in the first place.
I think it's so easy for us, living in the modern world, to forget how radically different pre-modern reality was. How did a pre-modern society justify its own existence? What did that home for the mind actually look like?
The sources describe it as a sacred world. In pre-modern societies, people lived in a reality where the divine embraced existence. There was no sharp separation between the transcendent and the earthly. The social order, who ruled, who farmed, why we follow these specific laws, was strongly legitimized because it was anchored directly to the super-empirical,
To the cosmic
to
order.
the cosmic order. So if a king ruled, he didn't just rule because he was strong or his dad was king. He ruled because God ordained it.
And if you sinned, you weren't just breaking a social rule.
You were causing an ontological fracture in the very fabric of reality. Transgression was chaos. It wasn't just illegal. It risked unraveling the entire universe. The whole society required constant reanimizing, restoring that cosmic order, often through collective rituals. The nomos, the credible framework of meaning, was certain, pervasive, and externally enforced.
But the sources point to a deep historical irony here. The seeds of this secularization were actually already present within the Judeo-Christian tradition itself.
Yes, that's a crucial, crucial insight. Because of its monotheistic historic view and its concept of a radically transcendent God, the Judeo-Christian tradition suggested a separation of the human order from the divine.
God was outside the world looking in.
Exactly. And this created the intellectual space for humans to start analyzing the world without constant divine intervention, which paved the way for the scientific and rational revolutions that would ultimately challenge the religious structure itself.
The result of this widespread secularization, then, is a radical uncertainty about, well, about everything.
Everything. And on the social level, this uncertainty manifests as pluralism.
Pluralism being the symptom of lost certainty.
That's a great way to put it. You no longer have one shared objective reality. Instead, you have a much larger religious and ideological offering. You have dozens of reality-defining agencies competing for allegiance. You're just bombarded with competing truths.
And this leads directly to the core of the problem for the modern mind, what the sources call the problem of plausibility.
Exactly. The social construction of meaning can no longer rely on certain, indisputable, metaphysically certified value systems. The religious dimension dramatically weakens its nomos, its ability to be a credible, unquestionable framework that's tied to the ultimate meanings of existence.
So when you choose a truth today, you are acutely aware that there are 10 other equally legitimate or equally poorly legitimate alternatives available right next to it.
That's the crisis.
So the core transformation here is this transposition of certainty. What was once objective, external, and compulsory, the metaphysical certainties that governed all of society, is now transposed entirely onto the individual's consciousness.
That is the pivotal concept. The source states it so powerfully. Cosmology becomes psychology. History becomes biography. The burden of creating meaning, which used to be carried by the universe and the church, is now carried solely by the individual psyche. And this fundamentally changes how the modern individual experiences reality. This is what gives rise to the homeless mind. And if we look at this secularized, pluralistic modern cosmology, devoid of that transcendent support, we see this profound contradiction. On one hand, the breaking of the nomos creates enormous opportunities and freedom for individuals. More choice, more upward mobility, more self-definition than was ever possible in a traditional ascribed society.
But the cost of that freedom is crippling.
The cost is very steep. This immense freedom induces equally intense forms of alienation and a deep legitimacy crisis, which Berger terms anomia. The price of freedom lies in a compulsory quest for the meaning of their existence. And this quest is uniquely difficult.
Why?
Because the many agencies that promise meaning, whether it's self-help, political movements, modern cults, whatever, they cannot guarantee an omnicomprehensive matrix of value. They are all ultimately provisional. They're all questionable.
So contemporary society is defined by this pluralistic situation, where the weakening of institutions is just inextricably linked to secularization and the dominance of this technological rationalized culture.
And the sources frame this whole thing as a transition from fate to choice.
Which is a revolutionary condition compared to nearly all of human history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What was once viewed as inescapable fate, your religion, your family structure, your social roles, is now defined as individual will. It's a decision you have to make and remake daily. You're not born into a role, you choose a role. And even adhering to a tradition becomes an individual decision, which makes the adherence itself fragile.
The resulting state is perpetual uncertainty, the dissolution of everything that was once just taken for granted. And this environment of radical choice leads directly to the concept of the existential market.
The existential market. It's the mechanism by which the modern individual tries to manage this overwhelming amount of choice. If there's no overarching value hierarchy, every aspect of life amounts to a choice between different options, not based on metaphysical correctness, but often on price, or efficiency, or just personal preference.
So the hierarchy of values that was once given by God is now replaced by a cosmology of the market based on consumption.
Precisely. Religion itself, which was once the source of the nomos, is relegated to the status of a typical consumer product.
You shop for a spirituality that works for you.
You sample identities, you curate a self. This shift means that identity is no longer conferred, it's constructed, and often it's bought.
This market dynamic must just profoundly complicate socialization, that process of instilling a consistent reality in a child.
It does, fundamentally.
Right.
A traditional society had very few socializing agencies: the family, the village, the church, and they were all embedded in a coherent matrix of meaning. You learned a single, unified reality.
The pre-modern mind had a stable, predictable home.
Exactly. But in contemporary society, secondary socialization, the internalization of all these institutional subworlds like schools, corporations, hobbies, it becomes layered, fragmented, and often contradictory. It's determined by the sheer complexity of modern life.
So the world that was internalized in primary socialization, that emotional, taken for granted truth learned from parents, is immediately and constantly questioned by the outside world.
Constantly. The proliferation of socializing agencies, especially the pervasive mass media, creates this fragmented economy of meanings. Every channel, every app, every institution offers a competing definition of what is real and valuable.
And since socialization relies so heavily on that affective, emotional dimension, this fragmentation must have devastating psychological implications.
It does, because different definitions of reality, all equally legitimate or equally poorly legitimate, they struggle with each other. They constantly weaken the plausibility structures of any single universe of meaning. Unsuccessful socialization, the source says, may result from heterogeneity in the socializing personnel. Meaning, for instance, if family norms clash directly with media messages, the shared definition of reality is weakened because the family has lost its unshakable religious support. They're just one competing voice in the market now.
So if a modern person tries to resort to some kind of collective ritual, it often fails because the meaning of that ritual is no longer strongly shared. There are too many counter-definitions of reality floating around, undermining the ceremony.
The difficulty of preserving any shared sense of reality is just palpable, and the consequence is devastating for the individual. The wide margin of choice they've achieved makes the certainty of having made the right choice rationally or effectively weak and poorly founded. The loose class structure, the complex division of labor, it all contributes to a relative uncertainty of status. The more fragmented and rationalized the social structure is, the more difficult it is to attribute a comprehensive meaning to your own existence.
And this is how the individual becomes the homeless mind.
Exactly. And to compensate for this rootlessness, we see the rise of what Berger calls functional substitutes of traditional institutions. These are the agencies that rush in to supply the identity market. The individual then becomes a consumer of identities offered on this market, constantly switching allegiance.
It's exhausting.
It is. And some of these identities are so subject to rapid fashion cycles that we can even speak of planned obsolescence, where the self you choose today is deliberately made irrelevant tomorrow, forcing you into continuous consumption.
So if the sociological theory defines the homeless mind as a consumer trapped in this identity market, we can see the deeply painful psychological fallout in the contemporary personal accounts. This is the subjective crisis of choice made manifest, especially when we look at neurodivergence. We're talking about the intensely common phenomenon of being haunted by the person they could have been.
This is the internalization of that failed market choice. The individual carries an idealized self in their head, a vision of someone fun, energetic, charismatic, witty, intelligent, that feels fundamentally blocked by conditions like autism or ADHD or anxiety. Before a diagnosis, this potential felt like a goal. It was someone they were tirelessly working toward becoming. After a diagnosis, one source described that person as a ghost.
That distinction is so vital, pre-diagnosis versus post-diagnosis. Pre-diagnosis, the individual often believes that the failure to achieve that ideal self is a moral failing on their part, a lack of willpower or just laziness.
Precisely. And that's the trauma of expectations. People describe suffering in innumerable ways, trying to meet that idealized, often explicitly neurotypical standard, only to realize that the struggle was against an impossible baseline that their brain just wasn't wired to sustain. This often triggers a profound, agonizing grief period following a late diagnosis.
And what's so critical, as the source material points out, is challenging the fantasy itself. The idealized potential was, in fact, never real.
It was a fantasy, a cruel illusion. The source says it was a product of NT adults not recognizing your differences.
NT being neurotypical.
Right. The neurotypical world often sees certain strengths in a neurodivergent person like intense focus or abstract reasoning and praises them as exceptional talent. But it simultaneously blames the individual for the negative ways they differ: poor organization, social awkwardness, sensory overload.
The expectations were an impossible standard that nobody could ever meet.
Exactly. The true failure wasn't the individual's. It was the system's failure to recognize and accommodate difference. It forced the individual to attempt the impossible.
And this impossible standard forces the necessity of masking.
Can you define that?
Masking is the act of replacing the natural self with whatever persona or mask is required at the time. And it's driven by this intense fear of being labeled cringe or inappropriate or becoming a target for ridicule, which is the ultimate social punishment in a marketized, judgmental society.
The psychological cost of that constant performance must be staggering.
It is. It creates intense internal friction and often results in catastrophic burnout and career crises. We see the clear link between the sociological pressure to achieve and the psychological breakdown. The source cited this devastating example of someone realizing their dream career, which required constant phone interaction, was not capable without literally breaking myself. It forced a devastating and painful career pivot away from that imagined self.
The subjective experience of the homeless mind is also defined by that feeling of being super behind everyone my age. This is tied directly to the structural barriers that are imposed by neurotypical society. The need for what feels like meaningless busy work, the endless, non-intuitive bureaucracy that just prevents them from functioning.
And the sense of being behind is amplified when it's coupled with other disadvantages, like poverty or trauma. It's a feeling of internal exile. One person cited the inability to pursue life paths they loved, like travel, not because of a lack of money, but because the planning and sensory overload, just the airport experience alone, was meltdown-inducing.
So the world, which is designed for the neurotypical, becomes an unwelcoming, fragmented place.
It does. Yet, paradoxically, the late diagnosis itself often offers a profound freedom. It provides permission to finally let go of that ghost, to accept that the ideal person was a non-viable mask.
It provides the essential, needed space to embrace the actual self without trying to perform to neurotypical standards. And this is the ultimate personal application of that sociological concept we talked about earlier. Cosmology becomes psychology. The external, impossible standard is finally replaced by an internal, manageable reality.
It's the realization that you have to accept the present reality and learn to work with your brain, not against the fantasy of what you thought you should be. It's an act of self-acceptance that releases the individual from the oppressive expectation that they must always be loud and sparkling and take the world by storm, a pressure often inherited from modern, overly optimistic childhood expectations built on the myth of limitless individual potential.
The transition from philosophical displacement in literature through the sociological theory to this grieving of the internal self. It brings us to the fundamental concept that's threading all these sources together, and that's alienation. It has both intrinsic and extrinsic causes.
We should probably define alienation broadly first.
Broadly, it's the state of feeling estranged or separated from one's milieu, work, products of work, or self. And it emerges as a natural consequence of this existential predicament we've been describing. Sociologically, though, we have to maintain the distinction between two critical yet often conflated terms.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to this. Clarify the difference for us between anomie and anomia.
Okay, anomie, a term coined by Durkheim, is alienation from society. It's a structural condition. It's characterized by the decay of meaningful social relations, norms, and shared values. We see this manifesting in things like spikes in crime or public corruption. The society itself is disorganized.
I see. So anomie is about the society being sick. What's anomia?
Anomia is self-alienation. It's a personal disintegration within the individual. It's the subjective feeling of being lost, without meaning, and personally disorganized. The sickness is internal.
And loneliness, as the sources note, is often seen as a specific type of alienation, the loss of those significant, supportive primary relationships that traditionally provided a buffer against the world.
Now, if we look extrinsically, the Marxist perspective gives us the socio-economic dimension. Political alienation occurs when the state, this vast impersonal bureaucracy, doesn't care about the individual. It forces you to relate to it as an isolated monad.
But the foundational alienation, according to Marx, is economic alienation.
Precisely. And that centers on labor and production. Your work, your labor, is controlled by others, which reduces your existence to just the material. Your creative, free activity is transformed into a mechanical, externalized means for survival that's controlled by capitalist forces.
And on the intrinsic side, we have psychoanalysis. Thinkers like Eric Fromm and Karen Horney focused on self-alienation as the most profound form.
Horney specifically defines self-alienation as the gap between the real self and the desired ideal image.
Which connects directly back to our discussion of the ghostly self.
Exactly. The self-alienated person becomes oblivious to their genuine feelings, beliefs, and likes, their real self, because they are so busy chasing an externalized, idealized image that's been manufactured by societal expectations. The real person gets lost in the performance.
This philosophical crisis really reached its height after the devastating world wars. The immense chaos, the disorder, the annihilation, and the crumbling of all traditional values caused existentialism to flourish. And that led directly to Albert Camus's concept of the feeling of absurdity.
Camus defined man as an irremediable exile, a displaced person deprived of the comfortable memories of a lost homeland and also deprived of the hope of a promised land to come. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, he said, is what truly constitutes the feeling of absurdity. It's the existential manifestation of the homeless mind.
And the playwright Ionesco defined absurd as that which is devoid of purpose, cut off from his religious, metaphysical, and transcendental roots. The traditional anchors of meaning are gone, leaving the individual directionless and feeling futile.
But we have to pivot back to the material reality, because the ultimate structural failure of this existential market, the most catastrophic form of contemporary displacement, is the crisis of the working homeless. This is documented in the source. There is no place for us.
That phrase alone, the working homeless, is scandalous in a society that claims hard work should guarantee security and a home. This is displacement that isn't philosophical at all, it's purely material.
It is catastrophic displacement caused not by an economic downturn, but by a thriving economy. One where corporate profits are soaring, but wages remain stagnant and rents skyrocket in booming cities. This structural imbalance ensures that hardworking people with full-time jobs simply cannot keep a roof over their heads. They're locked out of the basic security that the system promises them.
The source documents the intimate lives of families in cities like Atlanta Maurice, Natalia, Cara, Britt, Michelle, Celeste, who are aspiring to decent lives, but end up joining the ranks of the nation's hidden homeless. They are sleeping in cars or squalid extended stay hotels, which are often called the new tenements, and then heading out to their jobs and to school the next morning.
This is powerful, undeniable proof that displacement is not just a philosophical malaise for those struggling with existential questions. It is a pervasive structural problem rooted in gross economic inequality. The homeless mind is matched by the literally homeless body, demonstrating the ultimate fragility of modern capitalist life when that basic promise of stability is withdrawn.
It shows that in the existential market, some people can't even afford the foundational infrastructure of a secure home.
The prevalence of alienation, rootlessness, and meaninglessness means that the alienated protagonist becomes the dominant subject of major 20th century Western literature.
Absolutely. We see this archetype emerging immediately in James Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. Stephen Dedalus is profoundly alienated from the core pillars of his traditional society, religion, family, and his culture. He actively rejects the constraints of his inherited world to forge his own artistic self, but the price is this intense internal isolation.
Then you have Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. The narrator there is alienated not just from society structures, but from the very visibility of his own identity. He is literally unseen by others. He's forced into an underground existence, which is a profound act of social displacement. His entire struggle is a quest for recognition in a world that refuses to acknowledge his presence or his humanity.
And Albert Camus's The Stranger provides the ultimate sketch of modern man's disintegration through the character of Mersault. He's confused, estranged, and just fundamentally indifferent to the social rituals and emotional expectations of others. He embodies that post-secular mind that finds no intrinsic meaning in tradition or morality, and the result is profound alienation.
And we can't forget Franz Kafka's The Castle. It perfectly captures both existential and bureaucratic alienation. The protagonist, Kay, engages in this futile and hopeless pursuit of an unobtainable goal against a mysterious, unreachable bureaucratic system that controls every aspect of his life without any explanation.
This is the logical endpoint of that rationalized modern state that Berger described.
And if that's the Western lens, which often leans toward this more philosophical statement of absurdity, Indo-English literature approaches the theme with a different, often more communal emphasis. And this is due to historical and sociocultural reasons, primarily the dual impact of colonialism and partition. Alienation or rootlessness is a constant theme here.
Arcane Orion's The Sweet Vendor offers a clear example that's rooted in generational and communal change. The protagonist, Jagan, after his wife's death and his son Molly's return from America with these radically new, unsettling ideas, he finds himself ostracized and leaves his community.
So his alienation is a specific kind of despair. It's rooted in relational and communal loss, the inability to connect across the vast cultural gulf that modernization created. He's twice alienated, once by death, and once by the changing moral landscape that's embodied by his son.
We also find that powerful crisis of dual identity in Manohar Malgankar's Combat of Shatters. The Eurasian woman, Ruby, is caught lingering precisely between the Indian and Western worlds.
A stranger to both cultures.
Exactly. Her sense of belonging becomes a life or death question. She suffers an identity crisis that her English lover, Henry Winton, never has to confront. She is the living embodiment of the hybrid view of guest communities that the source material discusses.
And Kamala Markandaya's novels, especially Nectar and a Sieve, reinforce the theme that survival depends entirely on roots. If those roots, whether they're cultural, economic, or communal, are lost, one dies spiritually and often physically. This provides a direct counter-narrative to the abstract philosophical displacement of modernity, suggesting that tangible connection is paramount.
Then there's Balachandra Rajan's Too Long in the West, which provides the perspective of the educated modern returnee. The character Nalini, who was educated in America, returns to find her traditional village oppressive. She's the refugee from Berger's existential market, and she's told she belongs to a lost generation, out of place everywhere and acceptable nowhere, a refugee from yourself.
A refugee from yourself.
Wow.
Finally, we can turn to Anita Desai's works, like Cry, The Peacock and Fire on the Mountain. Her focus is deeply internal. Her characters, Maya and Nandakal, are emotionally famished. They crave privacy and escape from an unpleasant reality. They suffer from profound loneliness in this house and matrimonial silences.
Which is an agonizing internal alienation within the supposedly most intimate relationship. It demonstrates you can be completely alienated even when you are physically rooted.
So the synthesis of this literary view is critical. Indo-English novelists, perhaps because of the direct impact of historical displacement on their communities, they seem more interested in presenting the plight of the alienated individual and expressing deep compassion. Right. They show a strong temperamental and experiential identification with their alienated characters. They prioritize the emotional reality of the dispossessed personality over making a cool, philosophical, objective statement about the nature of alienation.
This has been a really sweeping analysis. We've gone from the poetic longing for the first place all the way to the structural failure of housing security. Let's bring Peter Berger back into focus and just summarize the dialectic that defines our time.
The core insight really remains this. The crisis of the homeless mind is the direct, inevitable result of rapid modernization and the institutional loss of stable legitimacy structures. The pre-modern world offered a coherent, sacred framework, a home for the mind, where meanings were unquestionable and external. This was the world of fate.
And we have transitioned decisively from that world of unquestionable fate to a complex, pluralistic world of radical choice and profound uncertainty. And this shift unleashed all these new forms of subjective suffering, from the deep nostalgia of the culturally displaced to the psychological grief over an unrealized self, and tragically, the shocking material displacement of the working homeless in thriving economies.
The modern condition really is a double-edged sword. On one side, it creates unprecedented freedom and enormous opportunity, particularly for those who were previously constrained by rigid traditional structures. But this freedom comes with a colossal price. It places the immense, exhausting burden of meaning manufacture squarely on the individual's shoulders. It constantly challenges the plausibility and certainty of any chosen reality or identity.
So the price paid for this freedom is that constant, low-grade uncertainty. The anguish of the unreached ideal self, the crisis of plausibility in public life, and the psychological burden of managing identity fluidity. As the sociological conclusion states, the weight is upon us. The future lies in the hands of men, and we can only rest on their choices. This is the weight and honor that modern society casts upon us.
So to connect this all back to your experience, for you listening, given that Peter Berger observed that these functional substitutes of traditional institutions rush in to fill the void, creating an identity market where the individual becomes a consumer of identities. And given that identity formation, in this sense, reflects the consumption logic of the capitalist system, this raises an essential and I think provocative question for you to mull over. What does it truly mean for you to define and embrace your real self when the only readily available models for personhood, for morality, for success are constantly being offered and replaced as consumer products on the market? How do you distinguish between a genuine identity and planned obsolescence?
We hope this deep dive into the nature of displacement, alienation, and the sociological reality of the homeless mind has provided you with some new context and clarity for understanding the burdens and opportunities of identity in the contemporary world. If you found value in this conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to VSOW, like this deep dive, and leave us a comment detailing what stood out most to you. Thank you for listening to VSOW.